The snow had been falling for hours, blanketing the small Colorado highway in a thick, uninterrupted white. Danielle gripped the steering wheel tighter as her tires slid slightly on a turn. Her breath fogged up the windshield despite the heater blasting warm air. The storm had come faster than the forecast predicted, and now the stretch between the last gas station and the rental cabin seemed endless. She glanced at her phone. No service. Just her luck. Her boyfriend, Eric, sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through the playlist they'd downloaded. His calm demeanor did little to soothe her rising nerves. "Only a few more miles," he reassured her, though she could tell from his tone he was estimating. They'd rented the cabin for a quiet weekend getaway, a retreat from the noise of the city. It was supposed to be picturesque and peaceful. Now, it felt like they were heading into the abyss. The GPS on the dashboard blinked uncertainly, recalibrating, as Danielle pulled onto the narrow road leading into the woods. Snow-laden branches bent under the weight of the storm, forming ghostly tunnels above them. The cabin came into view at last, a small structure sitting starkly against the encroaching wilderness. They unloaded their bags hastily, eager to get out of the cold. Inside, the cabin was cozy but simple, just a living room, a tiny kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. The walls were lined with faded pine wood, and the fireplace looked like it hadn't been used in years. Eric went about unpacking while Danielle lit candles to combat the dim light. Hours later, they'd settled in, warming themselves with hot chocolate and a movie on her laptop. Outside, the storm raged on, wind howling against the windows like a living thing. Danielle thought she heard something. Just under the sound of the wind, a faint knocking. She paused the movie. "Did you hear that?" Eric shook his head. "The wind. This place creaks like crazy." But Danielle wasn't convinced. She walked to the window, peering out into the swirling snow. The porch light barely illuminated the yard, but she could make out the fresh layer of snow, pristine and untouched. She shook her head, feeling silly, and went back to sit down. The night wore on, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. They decided to turn in early, hoping for clearer skies in the morning. Danielle crawled into bed, the heavy quilt pulling her into its warmth. Just as she started to drift off, there it was again. The knock? This time, it was deliberate. 3 loud, distinct taps. Her heart raced. She nudged Eric awake. "Someone's at the door," she whispered. He groaned, throwing the blanket off himself. "Probably a tree branch. I'll check." She followed him cautiously into the living room. He turned on the porch light and peered out through the peephole. "No one's there," he said, turning back. But Danielle's eyes drifted to the floor. Wet footprints trailed from the door to the window, where the curtain fluttered slightly. "Eric," she whispered, pointing. They both froze as a shadow passed outside the window. It moved slowly, almost lazily, before disappearing into the dark. Eric grabbed the fireplace poker, his only weapon, and unlocked the door. He stepped outside while Danielle hovered in the doorway, clutching her phone despite its uselessness. "Hello?" Eric called out into the void. Nothing but the howl of the wind responded. The footprints led away from the house, into the woods. Danielle begged Eric to come back inside, and reluctantly, he did. They locked the door and pushed the couch in front of it for good measure. Neither of them slept much that night. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, sounded like footsteps. When the first light of dawn broke through the storm clouds, Danielle felt an overwhelming sense of relief. They decided to leave immediately. But when Eric stepped outside to brush the snow off the car, he stopped cold. More footprints surrounded the cabin now, circling it over and over. They led up to every window and door. But there was something off about them. Each set was perfectly spaced, unnaturally symmetrical, as if whoever, or whatever, had made them wasn't walking at all, but being dragged. GPT icon. Snowstorms weren't unusual in northern Idaho during January, but this one was different. The flakes weren't falling. They were driving, whipping sideways against the windshield like a million icy daggers. Hannah gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles pale. The forest road she was navigating was barely visible under the storm's relentless assault. Beside her, her younger brother, Leo, was fast asleep, his head lolling against the frosty window. He'd begged her to come pick him up from a party after his car had refused to start, and she couldn't say no, despite her better judgment. Hannah glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 1:34 a.m. They were still miles away from her family's remote cabin, where they'd planned to hunker down for the weekend. Almost there, she muttered to herself, though the storm made every mile feel endless. The cabin was an old family property, built decades ago by their grandfather. It sat in the middle of the forest, surrounded by towering evergreens. Even in good weather, the place felt isolated. Tonight, it felt like the edge of the world. When they finally pulled into the driveway, Hannah let out a sigh of relief. She shook Leo awake, and the two of them carried their bags up the creaking wooden steps. The porch light flickered weakly, casting shadows that seemed to lurch and twist with the wind. Inside, the cabin smelled of aged wood and cold air. The small living room was dominated by a stone fireplace, which Hannah immediately went to work on. Leo plopped onto the couch, scrolling through his phone in frustration. "Still no signal," he said. "Didn't you say the cabin had Wi-Fi?" Hannah asked, striking a match and lighting the fire. "It did. Last time I was here, anyway." "Well, we'll survive a weekend unplugged," she said, though she wasn't convinced. Something about being this cut off, with the storm howling outside, made her uneasy. The hours passed slowly. The two of them played cards, told old stories, and eventually settled in for the night. Hannah took the bedroom upstairs, leaving Leo to crash on the couch. By the time she pulled the thick comforter over herself, the storm outside had turned savage. The wind roared against the cabin, and the windows rattled in their frames. Sleep didn't come easily. Hannah wasn't sure what woke her. Maybe it was the cold seeping into the room, or the eerie silence that had replaced the storm's fury. She sat up, heart pounding, and checked her phone. 3:12 a.m. She listened intently, straining to hear over the beating of her heart. There it was, a faint crunching sound, like boots pressing into freshly fallen snow. It came from outside, moving slowly, deliberately, circling the cabin. Her stomach tightened as she swung her legs out of bed and crept to the window. The world outside was eerily still, bathed in the dim light of a nearly full moon peeking through the dissipating storm clouds. But she saw it, tracks in the snow. They started at the edge of the forest and looped around the cabin. She scanned the yard but saw no one. Downstairs, a sharp knock shattered the silence. Hannah froze. The knock came again, louder this time. She grabbed her phone and called out, "Leo?" No response. "Leo, did you hear that?" she yelled, panic rising in her voice. Still nothing. Hannah grabbed the heavy flashlight from the nightstand and crept down the stairs, her heart thundering in her chest. The living room was dark, the dying embers of the fire casting faint orange light. The couch where Leo had been sleeping was empty. "Leo," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This isn't funny." The knock came again. 3 heavy, deliberate raps on the front door. She inched closer, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. Through the frosted glass pane of the door, she could make out a dark shape standing on the porch. "Who's there?" she called, her voice cracking. The shape didn't move. She backed away, her mind racing. She reached for the phone again, but there was still no signal. Her only option was to wait it out. Hannah locked herself in the bedroom upstairs, huddling under the blanket with the flashlight aimed at the door. Hours passed, though it felt like days. She drifted in and out of a restless sleep, her mind plagued by shadowy images and muffled sounds. When she woke, sunlight was streaming through the window. Relief washed over her as she bolted downstairs, calling for Leo. The cabin was empty. The front door was slightly ajar, snow piled in a crescent around it. She stepped onto the porch and looked around. There, in the snow, were the tracks she'd seen the night before. They circled the cabin, leading to the porch and then back into the woods. But something about them made her stomach drop. The footprints were huge, far larger than any humans. And they weren't shaped like boots or shoes, more like bare feet with long, claw-like toes. She turned back into the cabin and noticed something else. On the couch where Leo had slept, the blanket was rumpled, and there were scratches gouged into the wood of the coffee table, deep and jagged. Frantic, she grabbed her keys and ran to the car, praying it would start. She drove down the snow-covered road, her knuckles white on the wheel, until she reached the nearest ranger station. She reported everything: Leo's disappearance, the tracks, the scratches. The rangers searched for days, but there was no sign of Leo. His disappearance was eventually ruled an accident, a victim of the harsh wilderness. But Hannah knew better. She could still hear those knocks in her dreams, still see the shadowy figure on the porch. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind was just right, she swore she could hear something outside her apartment. A faint, deliberate knock. The forecast had warned of a major snowstorm sweeping through Minnesota, but nobody expected it to arrive this early or this fiercely. By the time Chris pulled into his uncle's lakeside cabin, the wind was howling and visibility had dwindled to mere feet. The old truck barely made it up the icy driveway, skidding to a stop in front of the dark, hulking structure. Chris climbed out and pulled his scarf tighter against the cold. His uncle's cabin was an old family retreat, sitting alone at the edge of a frozen lake surrounded by dense pine forest. Chris hadn't been there in years, not since his uncle passed away. Now, with no immediate family to inherit it, Chris had reluctantly taken on the responsibility of preparing the place to sell. He hated the thought of spending the night there. The cabin had always given him an uneasy feeling, even as a kid. Something about its isolation, or maybe the way the wind seemed to whisper through the cracks in its walls. He chalked it up to old memories as he trudged inside, snow crunching beneath his boots. The cabin's interior smelled of must and aged wood. The living room was dominated by a massive stone fireplace, its hearth cold and barren. Chris set down his duffel bag and went to light the fire. Soon, the crackling flames filled the room with flickering warmth, though it did little to dispel the creeping unease that seemed to seep from the cabin's very bones. Chris spent the first couple of hours sorting through boxes and furniture, making notes of what could be sold or donated. He unearthed old family photos, yellowed newspapers, and even a rusted rifle tucked away in a closet. The storm outside intensified, battering the windows with icy gusts. By the time night fell, Chris decided he'd done enough for one day. He reheated a can of soup on the gas stove, then settled onto the worn-out couch with a blanket. The storm roared on. The wind was relentless, its moans rising and falling like a voice. Chris tried to ignore it, telling himself it was just his imagination. He turned on a small battery-powered radio he'd brought, hoping for a distraction. Static crackled, interspersed with faint snippets of a weather report. Then, amidst the static, he thought he heard something else. A low, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing. He froze, the hair on his arms standing on end. He turned the radio off, the cabin falling into eerie silence, save for the howling wind. Knock, knock. Chris jumped. The sound came from the front door, two deliberate, heavy knocks. He stared at the door, his mind racing. Who would be out here in this storm? Maybe a lost hiker or stranded motorist. Grabbing a flashlight, Chris approached the door. "Hello?" he called, his voice wavering. No response, just the wind. Slowly, he unlatched the door and pulled it open, squinting into the blizzard. The porch was empty, snow swirling in the dim light of the cabin. He shone the flashlight into the yard but saw nothing. Just as he was about to close the door, his beam caught something in the snow. Footprints. Large, uneven prints leading from the forest's edge to the porch, then back again. Chris slammed the door shut and locked it. His heart raced as he backed away, his mind grasping for an explanation. Maybe it was just some animal. A bear, or... No, bears would be hibernating this time of year. He tried to push the thought aside and went to the kitchen to make tea, his hands trembling. As the night wore on, Chris couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the cabin made him jump. Every gust of wind seemed to carry whispers. He tried to distract himself by reading an old book he'd found, but his eyes kept darting to the windows, half expecting to see something staring back. Then came the noise. A scraping sound, faint at first, but unmistakable. It was coming from the side of the cabin, near the living room window. Chris froze, his breath catching in his throat. Slowly, he moved toward the sound, flashlight in hand. The scraping grew louder, more insistent, like nails dragging across the wooden siding. He reached the window and shone the light outside. Nothing. The snow-covered yard was empty, the forest beyond it still and dark. But the scraping continued, moving now, circling the cabin. Chris followed the sound to another window, then another, but saw nothing. His chest tightened as he realized the sound was deliberate. Something, or someone, was trying to get his attention. He retreated to the living room and grabbed the rusted rifle he'd found earlier. It wasn't loaded, but it felt better than nothing. He sat by the fire, clutching the weapon, his ears straining for any sound. The storm began to let up, the wind dying down to a mournful wail. Knock, knock. The front door again. Chris's heart hammered as he stood, the rifle trembling in his grip. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. Silence. He approached the door, every nerve in his body screaming at him to stay back. Slowly, he peeked through the peephole. Nothing. Summoning his courage, Chris unlocked the door and yanked it open. The porch was empty, but the footprints were back. They weren't just at the porch this time. They circled the entire cabin, looping erratically, overlapping in some places as if whoever, or whatever, had been pacing. Chris slammed the door shut, his breathing ragged. He decided then and there that he couldn't stay the night. He grabbed his bag, threw on his coat, and bolted for the truck. The storm had subsided enough for him to see, but the driveway was buried under several feet of snow. He climbed into the cab and turned the key. The engine sputtered but didn't start. He tried again, panic surging. Nothing. Knock, knock. This time, the sound came from the truck window. Chris screamed, jerking his head to the side. There was nothing there, just the fog of his breath on the glass. He fumbled with his phone, desperate for a signal, but it was useless. He was trapped. The cabin loomed behind him, its dark windows staring like empty eyes. Chris realized he had no choice but to go back inside. He bolted the door behind him and threw more logs onto the fire, praying for daylight. He didn't sleep. The knocks came sporadically throughout the night, always from a different part of the cabin. Sometimes they were loud and insistent. Other times, faint and almost playful. Once, he heard footsteps overhead, despite there being no second floor. When dawn finally broke, Chris stumbled outside into the pale light. The footprints were gone, buried under fresh snow, but the memory of them was burned into his mind. He didn't bother to check the truck again. He just started walking, determined to make it to the nearest town. As he trudged through the snow, he felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. He turned, but the forest behind him was empty. Still, the feeling wouldn't go away. Years later, Chris sold the cabin without ever returning. But sometimes, when he lay awake at night, he could still hear it. The knock,